Chapter 1. Geographical Background. Nowhere is the influence of geography upon history more clearly demonstrated than in that group of lands stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the plains and portions of Iran that we call the Near East. In vast desert regions, tropical forests, or the polar zones, man is engulfed in a hostile natural environment that threatens his very existence. In contrast, in temperate regions, humankind lives almost everywhere in relative ease, within a setting both favorable and stimulating. But in the semi-tropical, arid Near East, the balance between man and nature is far more precarious. Humanity could live there, and even prosper, yet its activities were largely conditioned by the character of the land. Its terrain, soil, rainfall, the distribution of springs and groundwater, and the flow and volume of its rivers. These elements powerfully affected human destiny. They determined trade routes and paths of military adventure, forced man either to settle as a farmer or to wander as a nomad, shaped his moral and physical traits, and to some extent, guided his religious ideas and beliefs. Thus, the history of any Near Eastern land must begin with a geographical survey, and ancient Iraq is no exception. Since no ancient geographical records survive, the following description must necessarily rely on modern Iraq, which, with minor adjustments, almost certainly corresponds to its ancient counterpart. Though the courses of some rivers may have shifted, and regions once fertile have turned barren, and vice versa, the general outlines of the mountains, plains, and valleys have remained unchanged. Comparative studies of ancient and modern flora and fauna, together with geological and climatic evidence, indicate that the climatic fluctuations over the past 5 millennia have been too slight to be historically significant. Anyone familiar with Iraq's landscape will find it strikingly evocative of its ancient past. The bare mountains, stony deserts, barley fields, palm groves, reed thickets, and marshlands all recall the scenery described in cuneiform tablets and monumental inscriptions. Beyond the large cities, ways of life still mirror those of antiquity. Shepherds on the hillsides tend sheep and goats as in biblical times. Bedouin tribes wander from well to well as their ancestors did. Peasants labor in mud brick houses using tools little changed from Babylonian days. And fishermen in the marshes live in reed huts and navigate high-prowed coracle boats like their Sumerian forefathers. Though the celestial bodies, rivers, and winds are no longer worshipped, their power is still respected, and many ancient customs and beliefs can be explained by present conditions. Indeed, few places in the world preserve so vivid a sense of their past as this land, where dead chronicles find living illustration. The geographical stage of our study forms a vast triangle of some 240,000 square miles, bounded by imaginary lines drawn through Aleppo, Lake Urmia, and the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab. Today's political frontiers divide this triangle mainly between Syria and Iraq, with minor extensions into Turkey and Iran. Yet these boundaries are recent. The whole region forms a natural geographical unit defined by the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Greeks called it Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Interestingly, the ancient inhabitants had no single name for their entire country. Their terms were either too vague, the land, or too specific, Sumer, Akkad, Assur, Babylon. Their strong sense of city-state identity and narrow religious political divisions prevented them from perceiving the territorial unity so obvious to us. The geographical unity of Mesopotamia was matched by a remarkable cultural unity. Within this triangular area flourished a civilization rivaled only by that of Egypt. Modern scholars have called it by various names: Chaldea, Assyria, Babylonia, Sumer Akkad, or simply Mesopotamia, but all refer to the same continuum, From prehistoric roots, it grew to brilliance in the dawn of history and lasted nearly 3 millennia, maintaining striking coherence despite political upheavals and periodic renewals through foreign influence and intermarriage. The cities that birthed, expanded, and diffused this civilization, Uruk, Nippur, Agade, Babylon, Assur, and Nineveh, were all located on or near the Tigris and Euphrates within the borders of modern Iraq. By the dawn of the Christian era, however, Mesopotamian civilization had declined and vanished, leaving behind only traces preserved by Greek scholarship or buried beneath centuries of sand. The desolate mounds concealing Babylon and Nineveh stand as mute lessons in humility, reminders of the transience of human glory. Herodotus famously declared that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. In many ways, Mesopotamia was equally the gift of its two rivers. Since time immemorial, the Tigris and Euphrates have deposited layer upon layer of fertile silt between the Arabian Plateau and the Iranian highlands, forming within the desert one of the richest alluvial plains in the Old World. Ancient theories held that the Persian Gulf once extended as far north as Baghdad, retreating southward through millennia of river deposition. Modern geological studies, however, suggest a more complex picture. While sedimentation has indeed altered the coastline, glacial and post-glacial climatic changes also played a role. Around 14,000 BCE, at the height of the last ice age, the Gulf was a deep valley through which a united Tigris-Euphrates river flowed. As the ice melted, the valley filled with seawater. By 4,000–3,000 BCE, the Gulf's waters reached the vicinity of Ur and Eridu, and only later did they recede to their present limits. Both rivers rise in Armenia, the Euphrates near Mount Ararat, and the Tigris south of Lake Van. Flowing through rugged terrain, they converge near modern Baghdad but diverge again, uniting only near Kurna to form the Shatt al-Arab. In antiquity, however, this great river did not exist. Each flowed separately into the sea. North of the Hit-Samarra line, both rivers carve narrow valleys through limestone and shale, their courses remarkably stable over millennia. Southward, the valleys merge into a vast, flat plain where the rivers meander and branch, creating permanent lagoons and marshes. The ancient cities, Sippar, Babylon, Nippur, Uruk, Larsa, and Ur, once stood upon or near these shifting courses, now left stranded miles from any navigable stream. The climate of central and southern Iraq is arid subtropical, with summer temperatures reaching 50 degrees, 120 degrees, and winter rainfall seldom exceeding 10 inches. Agriculture depended entirely on irrigation, because the annual floods occurred between April and June, too late for winter crops and too early for summer ones. Fields required artificial watering through a complex network of canals, reservoirs, embankments, and sluices. Maintaining these systems demanded vast cooperative labor forces, fostering both regional unity and political conflict. Two constant threats haunted the Mesopotamian farmer: salinization of low-lying fields and erratic river flow. Without artificial drainage, the salt rising from groundwater rendered fertile lands barren within generations. Meanwhile, unpredictable floods or droughts could bring famine or devastation, as vividly demonstrated even in modern times, such as the Great Flood of 1954. Yet despite such challenges, the alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates supported abundant crops. Barley, more salt-tolerant than wheat, was the staple grain. The Sumerian farmer's almanac, circa 1700 BCE, details the agricultural cycle: careful irrigation, plowing with a two-pronged wooden seeder, and repeated watering until harvest. Dates and barley formed the dietary foundation, supplemented by livestock and plentiful fish. Gardens shaded by palm groves produced fruits and vegetables, plums, grapes, figs, onions, cucumbers, lettuce, and garlic, irrigated with the same hand-drawn dalu still used today. Beyond the central plain lay regions of striking contrast: desert, steppe, foothills, and marsh. To the west stretched the Syro-Arabian desert, home to nomads who periodically raided the settled lands, as did the Amorites and Aramaeans in antiquity. To the north and northeast rose the rolling hills and snow-capped mountains of Kurdistan, traversed by tributaries of the Tigris and supporting rain-fed agriculture. These lands, though peripheral, played vital roles as cradles of early Neolithic and Chalcolithic cultures. At the opposite extreme, the southern marshes, dense with reeds and alive with water buffalo, preserved, even into modern times, echoes of ancient Sumerian life. Beneath this apparent uniformity, Iraq was a land of profound contrasts. Between plain and mountain, north and south, Sumer and Akkad versus Assyria. This duality, sometimes latent and sometimes violent, shaped the country's entire history. Ancient Iraq was rich in clay, bitumen, and agricultural produce, but poor in metals, hard stone, and timber. Copper, tin, and precious materials were imported from neighboring lands: Iran, Anatolia, Cyprus, and beyond, stimulating early trade networks that connected Mesopotamia with the wider Near East. Internal transport relied on waterways. The Tigris and Euphrates formed natural highways, while the maze of irrigation canals enabled movement between towns and villages. Overland routes linked Mesopotamia westward to Syria and the Mediterranean, eastward across the Zagros to Iran, and southward through the Persian Gulf, the bitter river of ancient texts, to Dilmun, Bahrain, Magan, Oman, and Meluha, the Indus Valley. Archaeological discoveries along the Gulf Coast, at Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates, and Oman, have revealed tangible evidence of trade and cultural exchange dating back to the 5th millennium BCE. These finds confirm that Mesopotamia, far from being isolated, stood at the center of a vast network connecting Egypt, Iran, and India. This brief and necessarily incomplete survey shows that Mesopotamia, contrary to Romantic belief, did not enjoy ideal conditions for civilization. Its twin rivers were both a blessing and a threat. Its fertile soil demanded endless labor, and its people, surrounded by mountains, deserts, and hostile tribes, faced constant struggle. Yet it was precisely in such adversity, on the edge of the southern marshes, that human genius triumphed, forging one of the earliest and greatest civilizations in history. Everything achieved in ancient Iraq was won through ceaseless conflict with nature and with man, and this eternal struggle forms the unbroken thread of Mesopotamian history. Chapter 2. In Search of the Past. To reconstruct the past, historians rely on two kinds of evidence: written and material. The term material here refers to any artifact, ranging from the most magnificent structure to the humblest household utensil. While material objects play only a minor role in more recent periods, their importance increases as we move further back in time. Since the historian cannot directly access unwritten data, he must depend on the publications of those whose work is to unearth ancient cities and cemeteries, the field archaeologists. Historians of the ancient Near East depend even more heavily on archaeologists than do students of classical antiquity, for in Mesopotamia, both objects and texts lie buried beneath the ground and can only be reached by excavation. Archaeological work in Iraq began in 1843 and has continued ever since. Initially conducted by enthusiastic amateurs, the discipline gradually adopted scientific methods at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, when scholars came to realize that filling museum cases with works of art was not an end in itself, and that understanding how people lived was far more important. Because of the fragile nature of their materials, mud brick architecture, clay tablets, and the necessity of digging ever deeper through successive levels of occupation, archaeologists were forced to develop refined techniques to record, preserve, and interpret their findings. Specialized teams, trained in and financed by European and American museums and universities, brought the resources of modern science to the field. Over the past 90 years, more than 30 major sites, virtually all the principal cities of ancient Iraq, have been extensively excavated, and over 300 mounds, tells, have been explored. The results of this international collaboration have been astonishing. Our knowledge of Mesopotamian history has been completely transformed. Historians who a century and a half ago had little more than a few biblical references and scraps from classical authors now find themselves overwhelmed by the sheer mass of data accumulating year after year, and deeply indebted to the archaeologists who uncovered it. Courtesy alone would justify a chapter devoted to archaeology, but there are further reasons for doing so. Throughout this book we will speak of tells, the mounds marking buried cities of ancient Iraq. We will refer to levels and strata, and whenever possible, we will cite absolute and relative dates. It seems best, therefore, to summarize from the outset the nature, methods, and development of what we now call Mesopotamian archaeology. To most visitors, their first encounter with Iraq's ancient sites is a shock. They are led to a low mound rising above the plain and told that it was once a great city. On approaching, they may indeed find impressive remains: the ziggurat of Ur or the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. But more often, they are confronted by heaps of sun-dried bricks, shapeless mounds, and scattered pottery shards. Their disappointment is understandable. The explanation lies in the fact that these ancient towns were built almost entirely of mud. Stone is rare in Iraq, but clay is abundant. In earliest times, houses were constructed of hand-molded mud, packed and smoothed into walls. As early as the 9th millennium BCE, however, people learned to mix straw with clay, press it into molds, and dry the bricks in the sun. This produced thicker, stronger, and more regular walls. Fired bricks, more durable still, were expensive, for fuel was scarce, and bitumen had to be transported from distant regions. Hence, baked brick was usually reserved for temples and royal buildings, while the majority of Mesopotamian structures were of simple sun-dried brick. Roofs were made of mud spread over reeds and branches. Floors were of packed earth, sometimes plastered with lime. These houses, with their thick walls, were cool in summer and warm in winter, but they required constant maintenance. Each year, a new coat of clay had to be applied to the roof to protect it from winter rains, and the floors often needed to be raised. Refuse was thrown into the streets, not removed. Over time, the street level rose above the floors of adjacent houses, allowing rainwater and waste to seep inside. The inhabitants therefore brought in fresh earth to raise their floors, forming new plaster surfaces above the old. Archaeologists often find several successive floors within a single dwelling. Eventually, disaster struck. War, fire, plague, earthquake, flood, or a change in the river's course, and the town was abandoned. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbled, filling the rooms and sealing in the household objects. In wartime, destruction was instantaneous. Conquerors often set the city ablaze, unwittingly preserving clay tablets that the fire baked into virtual indestructibility. Centuries later, new settlers would return, drawn by strategic location, fertile land, or ancient sanctity. Lacking the means to remove the debris, they leveled it and built anew upon the ruins. Repetition of this process over generations gradually raised the surface above the surrounding plain. Some sites were abandoned permanently, Others, such as Erbil and Kirkuk, have been continuously occupied since antiquity. Most, however, after centuries of habitation, fell into ruin, buried by wind-blown sand and leveled by rain into smooth, rounded mounds, the tells of modern Iraq. The archaeologist's task is to dissect this mass of walls, rubble, and soil in order to reveal the plan of the buildings, recover and preserve their contents, and identify and date the successive occupational levels. Depending on resources and time, several methods may be used. The quickest and cheapest is the trial trench, in which a few exploratory cuts are dug at angles across the mound to determine what lies beneath. Pottery and architectural fragments are collected for preliminary dating. This method, while imperfect, is suitable for surveys or less important sites. A variant involves cutting a long trench down the mound's side from summit to base, like slicing a cake, revealing a vertical sequence of habitation levels. A more systematic but laborious approach divides the site into squares, excavating each to a set depth before proceeding to the next horizontal slice. Finds from each square and layer are recorded and mapped in detail. Though scientifically ideal, this method is too slow and costly for most projects. The most widely used technique is the open area excavation. A chosen section of the mound is opened, and once walls appear, they are followed and cleared until the entire structure emerges. Several such areas may be worked simultaneously. When necessary, the upper, later buildings are removed to expose earlier ones. Deep soundings may be sunk to virgin soil to obtain a complete vertical profile of occupation. Using these methods, the principal Mesopotamian sites, Nimrud, Babylon, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, and others, have yielded extraordinarily rich results. Dating monuments and artifacts can be simple or exceedingly difficult. A brick stamped Palace of Sargon, King of Assyria, provides an absolute date, so long as the king's reign is known. More often, however, objects bear no inscriptions, especially those from prehistoric contexts. Relative dating must then rely on form, style, and material. Experience from many excavations has taught archaeologists that certain brick types, pottery shapes, weapons, and architectural styles are characteristic of particular periods. Together, these define cultural horizons, or archaeological phases. When even one item from a horizon bears an inscription or occurs beside a securely dated monument, the whole phase can be placed within a chronological framework. To express historical dates numerically, various systems were used. The Greeks counted from the first Olympiad, 776 BCE, the Romans from the founding of Rome, 753 BCE, the Muslims from the Hijra, 622 CE, and we from the Christian era. The ancient Mesopotamians, however, possessed no fixed era until late in their history, when they adopted the Seleucid era, 311 BCE. Earlier, they dated events by regnal years, either by simple numbering, the 12th year of Nabonidus, king of Babylon, by naming each year after a major event, the year Uruk and Isin were conquered, or in Assyria, by naming it after a senior official, Limu system. Lists of kings, regnal years, and eponyms survive in varying completeness. From these, modern scholars can reconstruct relative and sometimes absolute chronologies. The King List B records the first dynasty of Babylon, identifying Hammurabi as its sixth ruler, reigning 55 years. The Assyrian eponym lists extend continuously from Adad-Nirari II, 911-891 BCE, to Ashurbanipal, 6668-627 BCE. Cross-checking these with astronomical data, such as a solar eclipse recorded in the 10th year of Ashur-Dan III, confirmed to have occurred on June 15, 763 BCE, anchors Mesopotamian chronology securely from the 9th century onward. Earlier periods remain more uncertain, depending on fragmented king lists and varying interpretations. Hence, discrepancies among textbooks persist. Hammurabi's accession, for example, has been placed anywhere between 2394 and 1704 BCE. Most scholars now adopt the so-called middle chronology, assigning his reign to 1792–1750 BCE. In recent decades, attempts have been made to refine dating through physical methods, notably radiocarbon C14 dating, discovered by Professor W. F. Libby in 1946. Based on the decay rate of radioactive carbon in organic matter, the method provides approximate ages for bones, wood, charcoal, or shells. While invaluable for prehistoric periods, its margin of error, hundreds of years, makes it unsuitable for precise historical dating. The transformation of a thriving city into a mound occurs more swiftly than one might think. Herodotus, in the 5th century BCE, saw Babylon still alive, but ignored Nineveh, already in ruins for 150 years. By the time of Strabo, 4 centuries later, Babylon was almost entirely deserted. For a millennium thereafter, the dust of ages buried these cities ever deeper, and memory of them faded. Arab historians retained faint recollections of Iraq's glorious past, but Europe forgot the East. Only in the 17th century was Western curiosity reawakened, when Pietro della Valle brought back to Europe, in 1625, inscribed bricks from Ur and Babylon. By the mid-18th century, scholarly expeditions, such as the Danish mission, led by Carsten Niebuhr, 1761, began systematically recording Near Eastern monuments. Niebuhr's copies of Persepolitan inscriptions ignited efforts to decipher the mysterious wedge-shaped script. The true dawn of Mesopotamian archaeology came in 1843, when Paul-Émile Botta, French consul at Mosul, excavated Khorsabad and discovered the Assyrians. 2 years later, Sir Henry Layard followed at Nimrud and Nineveh. In 1877, Ernest de Sarzec unearthed the Sumerians at Tello, ancient Girsu. Within 30 years, a forgotten civilization had emerged, rivaling Egypt and Greece in splendor. Meanwhile, scholars in Europe labored to decipher the thousands of cuneiform tablets flooding their museums. The intellectual adventure, spanning more than a century, owed its triumph to men like Georg Friedrich Grotefend, who first recognized Old Persian cuneiform, Henry Rawlinson, who copied and translated the trilingual Behistun inscription, Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert, the trinity of cuneiform studies. By 1848, Akkadian, the Assyro-Babylonian language, was securely read. By 1900, Sumerian too was understood, though with lingering obscurities. Today, roughly 500,000 clay tablets are known, with countless more awaiting discovery, an unparalleled textual legacy from the ancient world. At the turn of the 20th century, German archaeologists revolutionized field methods. Robert Koldewey at Babylon, 1899–1917, and Walter Andre at Assur, 1903–14, introduced meticulous recording techniques that soon became international standards. The 2 decades between the world wars marked a golden age of Mesopotamian archaeology. Woolley's excavations at Ur and its royal cemetery, 1922–34. Heinrich's work at Uruk, Parrots at Mari, and major British and American projects at Ubaid, Nineveh, Tepe Gawra, Nuzi, and Kish. Each mound yielded new treasures and reshaped the history of Mesopotamia, revealing ever older cultures that illuminated the origins of civilization itself. By mid-century, Iraq had become an independent nation with its own museum in Baghdad and trained Iraqi archaeologists. Despite wartime interruptions, excavations resumed with vigor at sites such as Uqayr, Hassuna, and Akkar Kuf. After 1958, the young republic welcomed international cooperation. Germans and Americans continued at Uruk and Nippur. Iraqis discovered the prehistoric culture of Tel Es-Sawan, and new projects multiplied. British at Tel al-Rima and Abu Salabik, French at Larsa, Italians at Seleucia, Poles at Nimrud, and even Japanese at Telul ath-Thalathat. During the 1970s, large-scale salvage excavations were launched ahead of dam constructions on the Euphrates, Tigris, and their tributaries in Syria and Iraq. Nearly 200 sites, from prehistoric villages to Islamic towns, were surveyed or excavated, yielding vital information on ancient settlement patterns and early cultures previously unknown. The Gulf War abruptly halted archaeological work in Iraq, but sooner or later such peaceful pursuits will resume. Some 6,000 mounds await exploration, enough to occupy generations of archaeologists and epigraphers. As we trace our quest ever backward, beyond the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Sumerians, beyond the nameless peoples of the 4th and 5th millennia BCE, the light of knowledge now reaches into the Stone Age of Iraq, where early humans dwelt in caves and hills, leaving behind crude flint tools to mark their presence. Chapter 3. From Caves to Farmsteads. Until 1949, both textbooks and scholarly journals remained virtually silent regarding the prehistoric era of Iraq. Archaeological efforts had concentrated on the Mesopotamian plain, where any prehistoric remains, if they ever existed, were now buried under deep layers of alluvium. The lowest strata of several mounds had yielded enough material for historians to reconstruct a sequence of 5 proto-historic cultures, illuminating and explaining the dawn of Sumerian-Akkadian civilization around 3000 BCE. Yet all these cultures belonged to the late Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, and covered at most a few millennia. The true prehistory, the Stone Age of Iraq, was entirely unknown. A few flint tools had been found on the surface of the Syro-Mesopotamian desert, and as early as 1928, Professor D.A.E. Garrod, renowned for her work on prehistoric Palestine, visited Kurdistan and discovered artifacts in 2 caves near Sulaymaniyah. However, these finds attracted little attention outside a small circle of specialists. 2 decades passed before Professor R.J. Braidwood announced the discovery of the Neolithic site of Jarmo, rekindling interest in a field long neglected. Subsequent excavations by American teams at Barda Balka, Palagara, and Karim Shahir, 1951. The survey of the Zab Basin by the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, 1954-55, and Dr. R. Selecki's remarkable discoveries in the Shanidar Cave, beginning in 1951, have greatly expanded our understanding of Iraq's earliest past and filled a crucial gap in the prehistory of the Near East. The Paleolithic Age, the Old Stone Age, is the longest of the 3 classical subdivisions of the Stone Age: Old, Middle, and New. It coincides with the geological Pleistocene epoch, the most recent chapter in Earth's long history. The Pleistocene began about 2 million years ago and ended around 10,000 BCE, giving way to the Holocene, the epoch in which we now live. Together, these form the Quaternary period. The onset of the Pleistocene was marked by intense tectonic activity that in the Near East created the Taurus and Zagros ranges, part of the vast alpine Himalayan system, as well as the great Rift Valley running from the Red Sea and Dead Sea to the East African lakes, and the formation of the Mesopotamian plain and the Persian Gulf through the movement of the Arabian Plate beneath the Iranian plateau. These geotectonic movements were accompanied by considerable volcanic activity, as evidenced by numerous extinct volcanoes and extensive lava fields in Turkey, the Caucasus, Iran, and Syria. By roughly 1 million years ago, Earth's surface had reached near modern form, and erosive forces became dominant. Glacial activity alternated with warmer interglacial periods, known in Europe as the Gunts, Mindel, Riss, and Würm glaciations. Although great ice sheets never extended as far south as the Near East, Iraq lay at the crossroads of alternating wet and arid climatic phases. These fluctuations, though less extreme than elsewhere, shaped the landforms and hydrology of the region. During pluvial, rainy phases, powerful rivers carved deep valleys. In arid intervals, sedimentation prevailed. At least 4 such cycles have been identified in northern Kurdistan, correlating with the European glacial and interglacial stages. At certain times, the Tigris and Euphrates may have rivaled the Mississippi in size, and their tributaries, the Zab and Diyala, carried tenfold greater volumes than today. Throughout much of the Pleistocene, both the western deserts and the northern hills of Iraq enjoyed a temperate, stable climate, ideal for human survival. The oldest traces of human presence in Iraq consist of limestone, flint, and quartzite pebble tools, river stones flaked into hand axes, found in the upper Tigris Valley north of Mosul. These belong to the late Acheulean tradition, dating to roughly 500,000, 110,000 years ago. The next important site is Barda Balka, near Chemchemal, discovered in 1949 by Iraqi archaeologists. There, Acheulean-style hand axes and flint scrapers were found beneath layers of silt, associated with a temporary open-air camp. This culture, resembling the late Acheulean and Mousterian industries, dates to around 80,000 years ago, near the end of the Riss-Würm interglacial period. The Middle Paleolithic is best represented by the Levallois-Mousterian complex, discovered by Dorothy Garrod in 1928, in the lowest layer of the Dark Cave, Hazar Merd, south of Suleymaniya, and even more impressively at the Shanidar Cave, excavated between 1951 and 1960 by Dr. Ralph Selecki of the University of Michigan. Shanidar Cave, a vast rock shelter the size of 4 tennis courts, lies on the southern flank of Mount Baradost, overlooking the upper Zab Valley near Rowan Duz. Excavation reached a depth of 14 meters and revealed 4 main occupation layers. The lowest and thickest, Layer D, yielded hearths, ash deposits, animal bones, and Mousterian flint tools, all dating to the late Middle Paleolithic. The fauna, cattle, sheep, goats, and tortoises, suggested a cool, temperate climate. Most striking were 9 human skeletons, including 2 children and 7 adults, the remains of Neanderthals. 1, a male about 35 years old and 1.5 meters tall, exhibited all classic Neanderthal traits: thick bones, heavy brow ridges, receding forehead, and robust jaw. 1 individual had lost an arm in early life, amputated with a crude flint knife. Several had been killed by falling rocks. 1 body was laid upon a bed of branches and flowers, whose pollen analysis indicated death between late May and early July. Radiocarbon dating yielded ages of 46,000, 50,000, and 60,000 years. Layer C of Shanidar belongs to the Upper Paleolithic, dated between 34,000 and 25,500 BCE. Its stone industry, rich in finely made blades, defines the Baradostian culture, unique to this region. Later levels, CB, show a transition to microlithic forms, comparable to the late Aurignacian or Gravettian cultures of Europe. Similar artifacts have been found at Zarzi and Palagara caves and elsewhere across northern Iraq. These Upper Paleolithic inhabitants were hunters of wild horses, deer, goats, gazelles, and boars, living in an increasingly arid but still habitable land. They traded or maintained contact with neighboring regions, the Levant, Anatolia, and western Iran. The presence of obsidian tools in Shanidar and Hazar Merd, sourced from Lake Van in Armenia, attests to long-distance exchange. Though sharing techniques with the broader Near Eastern sphere, Kurdistan retained local originality. The Baradostian culture stands apart, and its Neanderthal population, unlike that of Mount Carmel, shows little admixture with early Homo sapiens. The Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age, marks the transition between hunting-gathering and agriculture. Characterized by microlithic stone tools and semi-sedentary settlements, it represents humanity's first experiments in food control and storage. In Iraq, this period spans roughly 9,000 to 11,000 BCE. Early Mesolithic sites include the uppermost levels, B1 of Shanidar Cave, and the nearby open-air site of Zawi Chemi Shanidar on the west bank of the Upper Zab. Here, traces of curved stone walls suggest circular huts. Flint tools include small microliths alongside grinding stones and pestles, the first evidence of cereal processing. Bone awls and ornaments of shells and animal teeth reveal new artistic tendencies. The inhabitants hunted wild goats, sheep, and deer, and fished the rivers. 26 human burials were discovered in the Shanidar B1 layer, arranged in what appears to be a ritual cemetery. Each adult was buried with a child, perhaps reflecting symbolic or religious practices. Radiocarbon dating gives an age of about 8900 BCE. Slightly later are Karim Shahir and Milifat. Karim Shahir, near Chemchamal, yielded microliths, sickle blades, and querns, suggesting early cultivation. Milifat, near Erbil, contained semi-subterranean huts and stone mortars, indicating more permanent settlement. Beyond Iraq, comparable Mesolithic sites, Muribet on the Euphrates in Syria and Ali Kosh in southwestern Iran, illustrate regional variation. At Muribet, continuous occupation from 8600 to 7300 BCE shows a gradual shift from hunting camps to mud brick villages. Wild barley, lentils, and pistachios were gathered, and gazelles hunted. At Ali Kosh, small mud brick houses housed early herders of goats and sheep who also gathered wild cereals, perhaps imported from nearby Kermanshah. From these beginnings arose the first agricultural communities. In these decisive millennia, humankind perfected stone tool-making, learned house construction, and, most crucially, experimented with the domestication of plants and animals. These experiments led, in various regions and at different times, to the cultivation of wheat and barley and the taming of sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. Hunting and gathering gradually receded in importance as people relied increasingly on farming and herding. This Neolithic revolution, as it is called, likely began on the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent, the only region where wild ancestors of wheat, Triticum dicocum, T. bioticum, and barley, Hordeum disticum, still grow naturally. Experiments by botanists J. R. Harlan and D. Zohari in the 1960s demonstrated that these wild cereals could be harvested abundantly with flint sickles, enough in 3 weeks to feed a family for a year, suggesting that cultivation arose from necessity rather than convenience. The most important Neolithic site in Iraq is Jarmo, near Chemchamal, excavated by Professor Braidwood between 1948 and 1955. The mound, 7 meters high, contains 16 occupational layers, 11 of which are pre-pottery Neolithic. The inhabitants lived in multi-room mud houses, used bone spoons and needles, wove flax or wool, and crafted fine flint blades, axes, and stone querns. Charred wheat and barley grains and the bones of domesticated sheep, cattle, pigs, and dogs attest to agriculture and herding. They adorned themselves with necklaces and bracelets, buried their dead beneath house floors, and fashioned clay figurines of animals and fertile women. Radiocarbon dates suggest around 60 and 750 BCE for the earliest levels. 2 other northern Iraqi sites deserve mention: Shimshara and Magzalia. Shimshara, excavated by Danish archaeologists, 1957-59, provides a link between Jarmo and the later Hassuna culture, circa by 800 BCE. Magsalia, excavated by Soviet teams, 1977-80, revealed what may be Mesopotamia's earliest fortified village, with a curved wall and semicircular bastion. By 7000 BCE, in northern Iraq and across the Near East, humans had ceased to wander in search of food and had become farmers tied to the soil. From clay they built houses, from stone they made new tools. Their livestock provided milk, meat, wool, and hides. Agriculture demanded cooperation, giving rise to early social organization, families forming hamlets, the nuclei of later communities. In time, new revolutions would follow. Metal would replace stone. Villages would grow into cities. Cities would unite into kingdoms, and kingdoms into empires. Yet the essential rhythm of life, the labor of humankind bound to the earth and its seasonal cycles, has remained unchanged since those distant beginnings. The absence of pottery in 11 of Jarmo's 16 layers marks it as one of the earliest farming communities in Western Asia, alongside Ali Kosh, Guran, Hasilar, and Jericho. Apart from Jericho's massive stone walls, these early villages were small and unfortified. Their inhabitants used stone bowls, bitumen-coated baskets, and leather bags, and they modeled clay figurines. From these experiments to true ceramics was but a short step. Crude, partially fired clay vessels appear as early as 8000 BCE at Muribet in Syria and at Ganj Dareh in western Iran. At Jarmo, circa 6300 BCE, pottery painted with red wavy designs marks the threshold of a new age. Though pottery was not as revolutionary as agriculture, it marks for archaeologists the beginning of history proper. From about 6000 BCE onward, through more than 3 millennia of cultural evolution, trade, migration, and conflict, the humble clay vessel becomes our most eloquent witness, preserving the silent record of humankind's passage from prehistory into civilization.